Why was incest common in ancient royal families? Imagine waking up not as an ordinary citizen, but as the child of a king. Around you, palaces shimmer under the golden sun. Servants whisper as they pass. Your family's name? Legendary. Your blood? Sacred. But as you stretch and rise from your silk-covered bed, there's something you already know. When the time comes, you won't marry for love. You'll marry your sibling. Because in your world, the world of ancient royal families, marriage wasn't about choice, it was about control. Every decision, every match, every whispered engagement in the quiet corners of the palace revolved around one guiding truth: to keep the royal bloodline unbroken. To let outsiders into the family meant diluting that sacred line, and for rulers who believed their power was divine, that was unthinkable. In this sleepy exploration of history, we'll discover why incest was not just accepted, but expected among the ruling elites of ancient Egypt, pharaonic dynasties, and other kingdoms where bloodline mattered more than morality. From brother-sister unions to uncle-niece pairings, from father-daughter matches to generations of entangled lineage, royal families believed something simple: purity of blood meant purity of power. Before we continue, take a moment to gently like this video, leave a thoughtful comment below, and subscribe for more slow, calm journeys into forgotten corners of history. Your support lets us keep telling these curious stories softly. Now, let's step back, far back, to a time when gods walked among mortals, or so they believed. In this time, royalty wasn't seen as fully human. Kings and queens were divine, living extensions of the gods themselves, and gods, as the stories told, married within their own bloodlines. Osiris married Isis. Shu married Tefnut, divine siblings creating divine offspring. And so, to remain godlike, pharaohs did the same. Marriage between siblings was not considered taboo among the pharaohs, but rather an affirmation of their closeness to the gods. To break that tradition would not only weaken their divine claim, but risk political instability. But incest among royals wasn't only an Egyptian practice. Across distant lands, from Incan emperors to Hawaiian chiefs, the logic repeated: keep the bloodline pure, keep outsiders away, keep power tightly folded within the family. In these societies, purity wasn't just biological, it was spiritual. Maintaining the sacredness of the lineage meant keeping marriages within the family, no matter the personal cost. In the grand stone halls of pharaohs, royal children grew up knowing their future partners might be their own siblings. Girls and boys played together, dined together, and eventually ruled together as husband and wife. It was not seen as strange, it was seen as destiny. But why? Why sacrifice personal happiness? Why risk physical frailty and deformity in their offspring? The answer was both simple and tragic: power. The fear of losing power was so profound that it overshadowed any concern for love, health, or individual well-being. To dilute the royal bloodline was to risk losing the very legitimacy upon which their reign stood. In this slow, thoughtful story, we'll explore the strange comfort ancient rulers found in their own reflections. We'll ask gentle questions. Did they know the risks? Did they see their children struggle? And why, even after suffering, did they continue? Because in a world where blood equaled power, nothing else mattered. In the sections ahead, we'll softly unravel this history. why incest became tradition among royals, what daily life looked like inside these twisted family trees, how royal children bore the physical cost of their ancestors' choices, and finally, why royal incest eventually faded, though not entirely. So, settle in, let the candlelight flicker, and prepare to explore a history darker than most, but told softly, gently, as always. Because sometimes survival meant loving those you never chose, and sometimes power meant binding your fate to your own blood in every possible way. Why incest became tradition among royals. To understand why royal families embraced incest, we need to understand how they viewed the world itself. Power in ancient societies wasn't just political, it was spiritual. And at the heart of this belief was the idea that rulers were more than human. They were living embodiments of gods on earth. Their bloodline was divine, their presence sacred. To allow that bloodline to mix with common blood was, in their eyes, an unthinkable corruption. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was the earthly incarnation of Horus, the god of kingship. Pharaohs ruled not by consent, but by cosmic right. Their authority was absolute, their lineage unbreakable. And so, to protect this lineage, they turned inward. Brothers married sisters, fathers married daughters, even half-siblings sharing a royal parent were encouraged to wed. The myths that surrounded them reinforced this practice. The gods themselves married within their own families. Osiris and Isis were siblings. Shu and Tefnut, also siblings, were celebrated for their union. If gods could marry their sisters, why shouldn't their earthly children do the same? But Egypt wasn't alone. In Peru, the Incan emperors adopted similar customs. The Sapa Inca, considered the son of the sun god Inti, often married his sister, the Coya. Their union was seen as a merging of celestial powers, ensuring the purity of the sun's bloodline. Hawaiian chiefs, too, believed in the sanctity of the bloodline, with sibling marriages maintaining the divine mana that granted them authority. Power was a fragile thing. Outsiders posed threats, not just militarily, but spiritually. Marrying beyond the royal family meant introducing uncertainty, introducing doubt, and in a world where cosmic balance mattered, doubt could be deadly. These unions weren't about passion, they were about preservation. The royal family viewed itself as a closed circle. Outsiders were a risk, but within the circle, power could be contained, controlled, passed from one generation to the next without dilution. Yet even within this controlled system, cracks formed. Physical consequences, hidden from the public eye, began to emerge from the shadows of royal chambers. Still, the practice persisted, for to break the cycle was to challenge the gods themselves. Imagine being a royal child, told from your earliest days that your sibling would one day be your spouse, that your role was not to choose love, but to fulfill destiny. Your future partner was chosen not from admiration or affection, but from proximity and bloodline. Every ceremony, every ritual, every whispered lesson reinforced the message: your family's survival depends on you keeping the bloodline pure. And so generation after generation, royals chose siblings over strangers, not from desire, not from ignorance, but from fear, the fear of losing everything. In the next section, we'll step inside the daily lives of these royal couples. What was it like to marry your own sibling? How did they live? How did they view themselves? And how did their children bear the silent cost of their ancestors' choices? But that, dear listener, is a quiet story for the next part of our journey. Now that we understand why incest became tradition among royal families, let's step quietly inside the palace walls. What did daily life look like for those bound by such unions? What did it feel like to marry your sibling, to rule beside someone who shared your blood, your childhood, your entire ancestry? In the silent corridors of palaces in Egypt, Peru, and beyond, royal life was not the luxury we might imagine. Beneath golden crowns and ritual ceremonies, these marriages were cold arrangements shaped by duty, not affection. From early childhood, royal siblings were raised together, but not like ordinary brothers and sisters. Their playtimes were supervised, their lessons rigid, their futures dictated long before they understood the words husband or wife. They were taught that their siblings were not merely family, they were their destiny. When the day of marriage came, there were no romantic glances, no whispered promises, no personal vows. The date was chosen by astrologers. Offerings were placed in temple courts long before the ceremony. And when the moment arrived, a brother and sister stood silently side by side as priests spoke words older than stone. They were married not in love, but in lineage. Once bound, their lives became performance. In public, they presented unity. Together, they rode in processions, stood at temple altars, and offered gifts to the gods. Twin thrones symbolized harmony. Sculptures and wall paintings showed them serene, graceful, connected. But behind palace doors, the reality was often colder. In private chambers, many couples lived separately. Conversations between sibling spouses centered not on hopes or dreams, but on temple obligations, royal decrees, and the desperate hope of producing a healthy heir. Because that was their true duty. Producing heirs wasn't merely personal, it was political survival. And yet, many royal couples bore children who struggled. Genetic fragility, hidden from public view, crept silently through these bloodlines. Pale, sickly infants, children who failed to walk, heirs who died young, buried quietly without fanfare. And when mourning was over, new unions were arranged, new children demanded. What of affection? Did royal siblings care for each other? Perhaps in their own way. Siblings raised together often understood each other deeply. There was familiarity. In some cases, a form of quiet companionship developed. Not love as we know it, but solidarity, a shared resignation. Two people caught in the same web, neither able to escape. For royal women, life was harsh. Many queens married their brothers before adolescence ended. Their lives became cycles of ceremonies and childbirth, their value measured in children, not happiness. For many, death came young. Those who lived longer often found themselves replaced quickly should they fail to produce an heir. Royal men fared no better emotionally. Kings carried the burden of lineage, the need for a son, A dynasty's survival rested not on their power, but on their ability to produce a child stronger than themselves. Life inside these marriages was ritualized monotony. Mornings began with prayers, ceremonial baths, offerings to the gods, royal audiences, inspections of temple priests. Even moments of rest, walking in shaded gardens or visiting temple sanctuaries, were observed by servants and scribes. Privacy was almost non-existent, and individuality discouraged. Yet the people saw only the performance. Royal couples appeared side by side at festivals, silent yet perfect. They rode in golden chariots, their faces painted smooth and calm. They sat upon twin thrones, symbols of continuity. To the public, these unions represented strength, unity, divine power. But beneath the crowns, there was quiet sorrow. Heirs were few, and those born often suffered. Royal children, both precious and fragile, were educated with severity, taught to view themselves as gods on earth. Yet many struggled with illness, deformities, or developmental delays. Those who died were buried without record, their names erased. And the cycle continued. Priests told stories of Osiris and Isis, divine siblings whose union kept the cosmos balanced. Temples displayed carvings of sibling gods embracing, smiling serenely. These stories soothed the public, reassured the dynasty, justified the pain, because if gods married their sisters, why not kings? Love within these walls was ritual, affection ceremonial, and personal happiness irrelevant. In tombs, royal couples were buried side by side, their images carved in stone as harmonious rulers. But in life, their union was something else entirely. A duty performed, a script followed, a life endured. In the next section, we'll explore the cost of these unions, not just for the couples trapped within them, but for their children. What happened to those born of these marriages? And how did generations of royal heirs pay the quiet physical price of their ancestors' decisions? But that is a gentler story for our next chapter. The silent cost, consequences for the royal children. There is a reason royal tombs are filled with names that never ruled, infants whose titles were never spoken aloud, heirs who never walked the palace halls. The price of incest among ancient royals was rarely acknowledged, but always present. It came quietly, in the way a child's foot bent unnaturally, in a daughter's failing lungs, in sons too weak to be crowned. For generations, royal families protected their bloodlines with walls, walls so thick even light and truth struggled to pass through. But within those walls, something fragile lived, something broken long before the crown was placed upon the head. The consequences of incest didn't arrive with fire and fury. They whispered. Let us begin with what we now understand from science, though the ancients, of course, did not. When close relatives reproduce, the risk of passing on harmful genetic conditions increases significantly. Without diverse DNA, recessive traits, often silent and harmless when carried by just one parent, are suddenly unleashed. And in royal families that practiced sibling marriage for generations, these dangers multiplied. And yet, these children were celebrated, worshipped even, painted into murals as tiny gods, wrapped in gold leaf and laid in tombs before they ever reached maturity. They were born divine, but many lived painfully human lives. Take the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun. Modern analysis of his remains shows a portrait far from the glorious image carved into temples. His bones tell a different story: a clubfoot, a curved spine, a frail, underdeveloped frame. DNA evidence suggests his parents were full siblings, and his body bore the cost. But his story is not unique. Royal children born of incestuous unions often struggled with severe health conditions, physical deformities, weak immune systems, developmental delays. Many died young. Some were hidden. Some were mourned only in private. And some were expected to rule anyway. Can you imagine that? To be raised as a living god while barely able to walk without assistance. To be told you are the embodiment of divine perfection while your body defies you daily. The ancient world had little understanding of genetics, but it had endless stories to make sense of suffering. When a child was born sickly, priests might say the gods were testing the family, that the soul was too powerful for the body, that the child was born with special wisdom, even if they couldn't speak. These myths softened the truth, but they also prolonged the cycle. Mothers were praised for giving birth to holy children, even if those children couldn't survive infancy. And fathers continued marrying sisters, not in despite of the consequences, but because the ritual demanded it. For some royal women, the consequences were even more devastating. Imagine being a queen, crowned not for love, but for blood, knowing your children would carry the weight of your union, and that their suffering would be quietly accepted. You might bury 6 before one lived to speak. You might stand beside a tiny stone coffin while the priest spoke of balance and fate. But you knew, you had seen it, and you still had to smile when your next child was born under the same ceiling. These weren't isolated cases. In ancient Egypt, over generations, dynasties faltered because the next generation failed to thrive. When kings died without heirs, civil wars followed. Succession became unstable, and yet the marriages continued, not because they were blind, but because tradition held stronger than evidence. And yet, behind palace doors, some royals began to see the truth. There are hints, faint and buried, of doubts. Some rulers chose nieces over sisters. Some expanded their options quietly, marrying second cousins and distant relations instead. Others allowed foreign concubines to bear children even if they weren't wed. Small rebellions, quiet acts of survival. But for many, the cost came too soon. There were princes who never stood, daughters who never spoke, entire lines of succession wiped out before the children reached adulthood. Tombs had to be recarved, thrones passed sideways or downward, or were stolen entirely. And the burden didn't fall only on the body. Imagine the mind of a royal child, told from birth that they are the descendant of gods, that their parents were more than human, that they must uphold divine perfection while feeling anything but perfect. What if you were the child who broke the bloodline? What if you were the one who couldn't produce an heir? What if your body trembled in ceremonies? What if you limped in silence past murals that depicted you as flawless? What if you were the mistake they couldn't acknowledge? These children carried not just physical pain, but the crushing weight of expectation, and there was nowhere to place that burden, no sibling outside the circle to confide in, no one who could say, "It's not your fault," because in truth it wasn't. The fault lay in tradition, in the myth of purity, in the refusal to let the divine mix with the mundane, and the children, born in silk and gold, paid it for with bones and blood. And yet we must not look on them with pity. Many of these royal children, even in frailty, held power. Some ruled, some rebuilt temples, some signed edicts that shaped history. Their lives were not defined solely by pain, but it was always present. We see them in tombs, stiff and painted, crowned and stoic. But if we could hear them speak, they might whisper truths the murals never showed, that the palace was cold, that the rituals were heavy, that the gods, if they existed, had asked too much. Even now, in museums, their bones rest behind glass, fragile, thin, sometimes twisted, and we stare, curious, fascinated, awed by the age, but also haunted, because we know now what they didn't, that purity, taken too far, becomes a prison, that tradition, when unchallenged, creates suffering, and that the children, born in silk and gold, paid it for with bones and blood. And so, the cost of royal incest was not just genetic, it was emotional, psychological, human, and it was paid over and over again by those who never had a choice. Why royal incest faded into history. After generations of silent suffering and fragile heirs, royal incest, so long accepted as tradition, began to fade. But why? How did civilizations that once viewed sibling marriages as divine suddenly reconsider? And what lessons did they quietly carry forward? In the beginning, change was not driven by compassion, nor by sudden realization of the harm caused. Instead, the unraveling of this ancient tradition was gradual, pragmatic, and driven largely by political necessity. Dynasties weakened, succession crises erupted, bloodlines too tightly bound could no longer produce strong heirs. The survival of kingdoms became threatened not by external invasions, but by internal fragility. And when heirs failed to thrive, rulers looked outward, reluctantly at first. One of the earliest changes came through political marriages. Faced with failing dynasties, some royal families arranged unions with powerful outsiders, not as a rejection of tradition, but as a desperate strategy to stabilize power. Foreign princesses were chosen not for love, but for alliances. These unions, though controversial, infused weakened bloodlines with new strength, and quietly, the old fears began to soften. Religious shifts also played a role. As cultures evolved and gods changed, so too did the myths that justified sibling unions. New deities emerged, old stories were retold. The divine sibling marriages once celebrated became symbolic rather than literal. Priests no longer insisted that kings must mimic the gods to retain legitimacy. Knowledge, too, spread. Exposure to other civilizations revealed different ways of ruling, of marrying, of building dynasties. Trade routes carried not just goods, but ideas. Royal courts began to see that power could be maintained without entangling bloodlines. Slowly, rituals shifted. Political marriages became common. Ceremonial sibling unions became rare. By the late periods of ancient Egypt, sibling marriage among royalty was no longer the rule, but the exception. Foreign queens graced palaces once reserved for sisters. Temples still honored ancient gods, but dynasties no longer tied their fate to familial unions. The age of divine incest waned. In Peru and Hawaii, similar shifts occurred. As external pressures mounted and societies grew more complex, rulers adapted. Political alliances outweighed sacred traditions. Mana, once preserved through blood alone, was now reinforced through conquest, diplomacy, and cultural strength. Yet the memory of these practices endured. Artifacts, tombs, and inscriptions remained. They told future generations the story of power bought at too high a price. And while no formal proclamations banned royal incest, it faded naturally, as history often does, through slow neglect, quiet adaptation, and the silent weight of consequence. What did these ancient civilizations learn? Perhaps nothing conscious, but in their evolving rituals, in their widening courts, and in their surviving dynasties, they carried forward an unspoken truth. Purity, when preserved too tightly, leads not to strength, but to collapse. And so, dear listener, as we conclude this gentle journey through history's darker corners, let us reflect softly. Not all traditions endure for wisdom. Some persist through fear, and some, thankfully, fade. In the quiet corridors of ancient palaces, in the frail lives of royal children, and in the silence of forgotten tombs, the legacy of royal incest lingers, but only as memory. Thank you for joining this slow exploration of power, control, and the hidden costs of keeping bloodlines too pure. Sleep softly, and remember, history's strangest truths are often told in whispers.